Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Champagne. I'm your host, and I want to welcome you to Change Ready, which is an original series brought to you by Behind the Human and the Veloci. It's a series in which we are doing everything possible to future-proof our minds and thrive in an era of unprecedented change. Today, I'm speaking with Jerry Colonna, founder and coach at Reboot.io, and the author of the bestsellers, which is always nice to say, two of them in the queue now, Reunion and Reboot. And I think this is my third time, Jerry, where we've been behind the mic together, and I consider it a privilege and an honor every time. So I'm really excited to have you back. Thank you for joining.
Well, thank you for having me, and the privilege and honor is mutual.
Thank you. So in preparing for this conversation, I have a fairly decent pulse about you and your background and your work and so forth, given our past conversations. But I decided I pulled out my book, Personal Socrates, and reread your chapter. And everyone who's listening, there's a chapter that features Jerry's brilliant mind and some of his questions and thoughts and perspectives and so forth. And it really kicked my chair back going through, because I said the opening question for your chapter, first of all, is just evergreen. I don't think it'll ever be out of date. It's always relevant in some capacity. And for this series particular, when we're thinking about the future and disruption and change and uncertainty, and then of course the flip side of all the beautiful innovation that's happening and so forth, this question of how can I accept the world as it is pretty darn powerful. So I wanted to start there and just get your perspective on that question in relation to, with the lens of the world that we're in right now and where we're going the next 5 to 10 years with all of this change. And I didn't even know how to describe it. Just I want to say a dynamic environment is the only words that are coming to mind, but I'll stop there and let you speak.
Well, it's interesting that you focus on that question, Mark, because as I hear it reflected back to me, there is a piece of me that would counsel to not accept the world as it is. So that's an interesting reaction. But I think your opening on it is important and correct in that it's an evergreen. And it's an evergreen posture to take. And I think that what I'm really getting at in that question and that stance is really a Buddhist prescription, if you will, for happiness.
Okay.
And that was the first sort of internalization. It's like, where did that question come from? And I think of the teachings, and I think the Dalai Lama himself has spoken about this. It's learning to accept the world as it is. It's learning to accept things as they are. But if we just stop with that, like so much of the teachings of Buddhism, if you only unpack the first layer of it, it can lead to a kind of nihilistic view of the world, right? Think of the second noble truth being that which we do to alleviate suffering increases suffering, right?
Yeah.
And there is a call to action that is implicit in all of the teachings, which is really more around and so this being, the world being as it is, what will you do about it?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Which is in some ways a better framing of that stance, if you will. And so it gets at the heart of what I think you might be reaching for with this unpacking of change. And let me, as I always do, frame it as a question. How do we accept the inconstancy of the world, the impermanence of the world? How do we accept the challenges of the world? Because boy, howdy, don't we live in a challenging world. How do we accept that while holding fast and true to our values and holding fast and true to our moral and ethical responsibilities to creating a world that we believe needs to be?
Yeah.
How do we hold the tension between accepting the fact that things are always going to feel challenging, and nevertheless we work towards peace?
But I think you're nailing it, and I shouldn't be surprised, but it's a really good reflection, because I think it has to be a two-part question.
That's right.
Because the way that I see the question, the reason I think it's so evergreen and it's always been so impactful for me is to even get into a headspace of ideating and innovating and thinking of, or potentially designing a future that you're proud of and so forth. I'd say a lot of us are so charged, and there's so much mental capacity just stolen by emotion of the current situation, that a question like, how do I accept the world as it is? And like you said, just accept the impermanence of it right now. It feels like a breath of fresh air in the mind, so that you can
Hmm.
see past the horizon a little bit.
Yeah. As you lean into the perspective here, it is not, the acceptance isn't in the stasis, meaning we live in a world with such strife and division, as I've been saying recently. It's a world in which it seems acceptable to murder a child for an ideology.
Yeah.
And I am not suggesting that we should accept that
Yeah.
aspect of the world.
Yeah.
But there is a deeper acceptance that's there. And the acceptance is the understanding that there's always a tension in the world. There's
Mhm.
always a movement towards strife. And given that, what choices will you make? Given the acceptance of the fact that human beings are vastly imperfect and frail, and that we're filled with fear and shame and anger, and even in its worst expression, hatred. And yet we also have the capacity for enormous love and care and joy. And given those facts, what choice do you make?
Mhm.
Do
Mhm.
you choose to give in to, as Lincoln described it, the better angels of your nature?
Yeah.
Because the better angels and the lesser angels both exist. That's the acceptance, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're working with various leaders and CEOs, and I guess the idea of tension comes up,
Mm,
just this tension that always exists. And I think we can label it as, you don't have to put judgment on it, but just that it's there.
that's right.
But how do you advise or help some of these CEOs to take the micro pause to ask some of those questions? Because I feel like that's a bit of the superpower, because the tension's there, but then there's so much going on that it's easy to get caught up in the autopilot, and you don't pause and ask some of these questions that you're referencing around, what are my values here? Is this the path I want to go down? You know what I mean?
I do. And I can't help but immediately get into coach mode when you start to think about that. And I imagined for a moment working with someone who was so rushed that they don't have the capacity to ask these sorts of questions, this hypothetical that you were describing.
Yeah.
And then I said, what would I say to that person? And what I would say to that person, the question I would ask to that person, what I would not say to that person, let's put it this way,
Okay.
is slow down, pause, and start to think about things that are important. I
Yeah.
would not ask them that. I would not suggest that. And the reason is because it would induce profound resistance. Are you kidding me? You expect me to slow down and ponder the universe? Knowing that I would get that resistance, I would come at it slightly differently. I would say, what would happen if you were to stop? What
What a
would
beautiful
happen if you were to
distinction.
pause? Right? Because what you want to do is just induce, you want to get behind the reaction. And so much of what you're talking about, whether it's the stress and burnout that we encounter, so much of that has become the norm that the capacity to even question whether or not that should be the norm is
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah. that is something that really that's something that keeps me up at night because I see it and obviously you see it and feel it. There's so many examples. There's the mind, there's just what we accept as okay in society. There's so much that is just being normalized in 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 an extreme way that it's a bit scary and
I think
frightening.
I think that's right. Just in our, not even our lifetimes, but in our work lifetimes. I've been working since for 40 years now. I just turned 60, and I've been in an adult career since I was 20, right? So much has become acceptable and normal, and so much has been written about it, this notion of always on. Here I am in the middle of wilderness via satellite internet connection, and we're doing this conversation.
Yeah.
So that's delightful, and it's wonderful to see my friend Mark and to have this conversation. And yet, at the same time, what has happened to an off the grid kind of experience? What has been normalized is, and forget the political realm for it, but the normalization of outrage in our discourse, or the normalization of attack as a mode of operating, or the normalization of a 7 by 24 work mindset leaves very little room for not just the pausing that we were talking before, but for the innovation and the spontaneity that are so necessary for positive change, for positive movements forward.
Yeah. And this is the whole vision behind this series is if can we have more conversation around this topic? Because I know I'm biased, of course, when it comes to mental fitness, but that's what fuels me is that I felt it myself and I've seen it happen over and over again that for us to show up and have a beautiful ripple effect in this world and be the ones that come up with beautiful innovations that can help many millions of humans, it's hard to do that if you're stuck in a survival mode of thinking and in that just get through the day and ride the autopilot train. So for me, like that's what motivates me the most is trying to bring more and more of these practices to just slow things down a little bit, get people thinking and curious to
Right.
what's possible. And wait a second, I can feel good more days than not when I wake up. It's okay to feel like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I often joke this is why God invented the weekends. And I think that there is something profoundly important in being able to shift the dynamic. Here again, we're speaking during my sabbatical. This is the 17th year in a row in which I have taken July and August off. Now, what does that mean? It does not mean that I take vacation. I take vacation during that time. I'm
Yeah.
camping now, and a few weeks ago, I was camping truly off the grid outside of Yellowstone with my son. But what I often speak about is, for me, sabbatical is not a time of not thinking, of not working. Sabbatical is a time for shifting the cadence of
Ooh,
thinking.
yeah.
Just today, I finished a book I started 7 weeks ago, which is the volume one of 5 volumes of the collected works of Wendell Berry in the
Okay.
Library of America series. It's 982 pages, right?
Giddy
Um,
up.
but for me, that's a kind of shift in cadence.
Yeah.
It's rather than trying to read 5 books a week, which I normally do, I savored
Oh, I
one
see.
book and luxuriated and would reread passages. And it's all fiction, it's collected novels and short stories. And I had been very familiar with Barry's nonfiction writing. This gave me a chance to just see his fiction and relate to it in a different way. And this is what I'm talking about. By shifting the cadence and shifting the landscape and shifting the location, I create opportunity for new thoughts,
Yeah.
new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching the everyday of my life.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm getting at is, how do we prepare ourselves for change such that change is not something that frightens us the way we normally deal with impermanence or the way we normally deal with uncertainty, but change becomes the thing that is the norm.
It is, whether we like it or not. It's whether we accept that.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
So how do you see the future, Jerry? What's your lens? What I know you've had a probably over 40 years at this point, a longstanding journaling practice. So there's just built in, and I know there's other practices, but that one in particular, there's a lot of built in reflection
Mhm.
consistently, which I imagine there's some questions and some thought around the next 20, 30 years of your life. You've got a lot of beautiful years ahead of you, right? And me too. But so I wonder
So,
how you think about that.
so you mean on a personal basis?
It could be both. If this series has done anything for me at this point, it's really fired up and you've already done it in this conversation, but some really nice questions to think about. What future I would I like to design? Would I be proud of that my kids get to experience?
Mhm.
And there's only so much I can do, but also knowing that there is a lot I can do as well, and keeping it in a container that feels manageable, so it's not an overwhelming situation when you start to turn on the news and whatnot, which then it becomes it's dark and scary, and it feels impossible.
Mhm.
So I've been really flirting with different questions like that and meditating on those and trying to, and even in my day to day, just building in more time of I would say stillness as
Mhm.
opposed to, okay, preparing this or preparing that, just from these conversations.
I guess I've been sitting here taking in your deepening question as you've been unfolding it. And the thing that occurs to me is that, and this might be an expression of the way I accept the change, I accept life as it is. I don't think about, I don't think about things the way you, you have been framing it. And I just want to pause because the awning on my van is now closing because the wind was blowing. So there's a little bit of a hum going on.
That's okay.
The way I think, but I do think about the future
Okay.
all the time. And so I'll make a distinction. I think about the future, but I don't think about change. And the way I think about it, and I'd offer this as a framework, what popped into my head is David White, one of his lesser known books is a book called The Three Marriages. And he talks about the three marriages being the marriage to self, the marriage to the other, and the marriage to the world, but work in particular. And if we were to use that as a lens into the question that I think you're asking, I bet it goes back to the first response I had. Are you talking about in the personal arena or are you talking about in a larger arena? And maybe the way I think about it is in three concentric circles.
Okay.
And the first is myself.
Yeah.
And the second is my family. And the third is the world at large. And
Mm.
I see them as concentric circles. And at the center of that is myself. And the first question that I would ask as I think about the future is, who would I like to be 20 years from now? Or more specifically, how would I like to spend my days?
Yeah.
Or even more prosaically, what would I like my eulogy to say? How would I like to be remembered? One of the tasks that I set to myself for this summer was to think about this question of legacy. And hint, hint, my publisher asked me to think about this question of legacy.
I'm
This
not
is
surprised.
why I'm thinking of this question. And so thinking about it in this concentric circle way, how do I want to feel about myself? I know how I felt about myself, say, 30 years ago,
Mm.
in my 30s. Pretty shitty.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about how depressed and anxious I was, and how the simplest way to understand it was that the inner me and the outer me were out of sync. And so as I have turned 60, as I look towards the future, because that's what I do right now, is I'm looking towards the future. I think of myself as an elder,
Mhm.
entering elderhood.
Modern elder. Let's use Chip Conley's language.
Yes, I very much think of myself as a modern elder and taking up that mantle. And so I know that I want to live in a way in which the inner and the outer me continue to be in alignment.
Yeah.
And then, interestingly, in my 30s and 40s, I thought about my children. And I continue to think about my children, but I think of them not as the children that they were, but as the adults that they are. And I've started using more and more of this word, descendants. And I start thinking about that concentric circle of those who will come after me. And do I want to hold that integrity through that circle? Of course I do. I want to be that kind of person. We just saw this at a Democratic National Convention last night. Do I want to be that kind of person where my child or grandchild looks up at the stage and says, "That's my father"? Of course I do.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then I think about that last concentric circle, the world at large. And I think about my responsibility to my descendants. And how do I want to impact and influence that larger circle? Because I cannot think about myself without simultaneously thinking about the future descendants and the
Yeah.
future and that wide gap. How many? There'll be thousands of people who will trace their lineage back to me. And do I
Wow.
want them to think about what world do I want them to live? How do I want them to live their lives? Do I want them to live in fear? Do I want them to live in hate? Do I want them to live anxious, burned out, getting meaning from work? Of course not. So that's the context in which I think about your question about change. I think about time, and I think about the future, and I think about those concentric circles, and I think about this notion of, from my lips to God's ears, somebody 20 years from now picking up a book that I wrote and going through again with a highlighter, going through and dog-earing it, going through and slipping Post-its in it, or whatever the future equivalent of that will be, and saying, this book made a difference in my life.
This is what is I such a beautiful, first of all, beautiful image. And I could see this. I'm a visual person, so I see those circles and just I was aggressively writing down the questions. I'm a big fan of good quality questions. But at the same time, thinking you could run this exact flow and exercise with a CEO of a company that is faced with, let's just AI is the thing that's in the news, obviously, and then we're probably where we're seeing a lot of disruption. Okay, we're at a point or a
Right.
junction in the organization's history and future and so forth. And to go through probably that exercise, it would be merged, but to go through that exercise as a leader and a leadership team from you as individuals, but also as an organization and a team, it works. Like that would work in that setting as well. What I love about this kind of stuff, and I'll use some of your language, but radical self inquiry. This doesn't take that long to at least start the process of answer. We're not talking about a 7-day silent retreat to pull out a lot of insight from these questions. Sure, that there's many things and practices we can do to amplify it, but even just taking a couple hours together to pause and think about these questions, I just feel could go such a long way. And
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think about taking a senior leadership team away and having them do a values exercise, which you and I and our colleagues, our brilliant colleagues around the world do all the time. And yet, if you applied what I just came up with in my mind is three concentric circles in that way, my interpretation of David White's three marriages, and you said to individuals, you want to pick on a CEO. So let's pick on a CEO and we'll say to her, okay, so let's talk about your concentric circles. But let's also talk about the concentric circles of those who work with you.
yeah,
What impact do you want to have on the descendants of your senior vice president for marketing? What?
yeah,
It's not that you bear a responsibility, but you actually have the opportunity to be able to create the kind of environment that allows that individual to flower so that they then get to live in inner outer alignment, and they then get to model for their children, who then get to model for their children. You see
yeah.
how quickly
Oh,
this
yeah.
becomes this beautiful series of overlapping concentric circles where people are touching one another?
Yeah. It's wonderful. And what I find always interesting about with questions like this is, or creating environments around you. We're all creating environments, whether we ask the questions or not. So for me, I'd rather at least take some time to ask some of these questions so I can have a little bit of say in what's happening here versus maybe without thinking about it, maybe actually I'm not leaving people feeling the way that I think I am, as an
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
right?
I'm doing some work. I'm speaking at the upcoming CEO summit for conscious capitalism in
Okay.
October. And I've been thinking a lot about what is it that I want to say. And being Jerry, I'm going to ask a question. Conscious to what? What are we conscious of? And I think, Mark, what I'm asking is conscious about the things that we're talking about here. The interdependent nature of each of us on each other. The sense of this inner and outer alignment that has to flow from the individual through the close in circle to the broader circle.
Yeah.
And conscious of the consequence of not having that alignment. You and I work so much with people who are in distress. And when you unpack the sources of the distress, simplistically put, it's this lack of inner and outer alignment. It's being driven to extremes by things that seem to be beyond your conscious control. Radical self-inquiry, asking oneself questions. You don't have to pause for 7 hours to ask a meaningful question. You have to
Mhm.
pause for 30 seconds
Yeah.
and say, why am I acting so frantically?
Yeah. Oh,
We
it's
don't
powerful.
have to go to the monastery on the mountain to ask ourselves a question. You talked about my journaling practice, which goes back to when I was 13 years old. That's how long it is. That's all I do is, why do I feel what I feel? This is what
Mhm.
I feel, right? So the first question is, how do I feel?
Yeah.
The second question is, why do I feel that way? And the third question, more often than not, is, what would I like to change about those feelings? What do I have to do? What do I have to let go of? And those are hard questions,
Mhm.
but that's where the gold is.
Yeah. What I like too about the notion of starting with ourselves, of course, but then branching out and thinking about the ripple effect, right? Of with our teams, our loved ones, our kids, and so forth, and anchoring it to some of these topics, like the future or how we want our organization to be seen and what legacy do we want to leave behind and so forth. Just I feel like just the very nature of that work, we can get more teams doing that. The ripple effect of that, hopefully, makes me think of what you've written about in Reunion.
Mm.
And right, because we just now it's less division, it's more, hey, we're broadening our perspective of, narrow line, we're looking straight down this highway and that's it. Let's open up a little bit and see what happens here and collaborate and so forth. Because there's just, to your point earlier on, there's so much division on just almost everything that I wonder, and I don't have the answer for this, but it's just coming up in conversation with you, but I wonder if we can take something like the future where there's a lot of people who are nervous about the uncertainty and how fast things are changing and flip that around and be one of the solutions to bringing us closer together as a society and humanity in general.
I think that's right. I think that if in Reunion I wrote about the subtitle of leadership and the longing to belong, and I looked at the question of what is a leader's responsibility in a world filled with division, and more importantly, what is the opportunity to respond to this longing to belong? And the important prerequisite in asking that question is to understand, and I wrote about this, to understand the universality of some of these feelings. When I released Reboot, which is now 5 years ago, which staggers my mind, my first book, I did not expect the number of people to write to me and say, the things you wrote about, those things happened to me. Or, as one person said, did you have a microphone hidden in my living room growing up? They all spoke to this interesting experience, which I, taking from someone who said it to me, this notion that your story, Mark, is my story.
Yeah.
And how powerful that is as a balm in a world where we seem to be at each other's throats all the time. So let's just pause with and hold that for a moment. And let's apply that to what you're asking, which is about change, uncertainty, and by my extension, the future. If it's true that we all want at some level love, safety, and belonging, and I believe it is true, we not only want that now, we not only experience the deprivations of that, perhaps when we were children, thus feeling empathetically connected to one another, but we want that for the future.
Yeah.
We want that for our children and our children's children, which means it's the basis of not only empathy, but an interdependence. Because if I'm going to build a world in which I feel, or more appropriately, my grandchildren feel love, safety, and belonging, I need to work towards allowing you to have that in your world so
Yeah.
that your grandchildren can have that. This notion of really understanding that your story is my story is really another way of saying, just like me, you're human. And just like me, or just like my descendants, your descendants are human.
Yeah.
And not only do they want love, safety, and belonging, they deserve it. By the mere act of being human, they deserve it. I find it incredibly helpful to look at the challenge of change, the uncertainty, the fear that impermanence can create, the bittersweetness of impermanence. I find it really helpful to look at those challenges through the lens of that universal experience. Because I can look forward into the future and say, they want clean air, clean water, the means to pay their bills. They want to live in a world without violence, without hatred. They want to give you an image. They want to drop their kid off at the school bus stop and give them a lunchbox and know that they're safe.
Yeah.
That's what people want.
So many things when you take the time to just return back to the fundamentals and the
Yes.
basics. I think about this comes up probably most often in health, right? Like
Yeah.
there's so many beautiful innovations and wearables and this and that, but at the end of the day, the vice president of science and athlete performance at Whoop said, "Am I sleepy when I want to be sleepy, and am I alert when I want to be alert?"
Right.
As I said, I just canceled my Whoop membership.
Right. Right.
But it's so true. Did I get sunlight today? And
That's
coming
right.
back to these fundamental motions and things that we've just evolved with, essentially around safety and belonging and community and so forth, just to reset our perspective.
And so if we go all the way back, it's like, how do we create the time to ask ourselves these questions? Oh, let's simplify the statements. Let's simplify the questions to those basic fundamental human needs. I need sleep. I need water. I need love. I need touch. I need alone time. I need time with friends and family. I need to not worry about this. I need to have these basics that really can be a guide for how to live in turbulent times.
So well said.
During the first months of the pandemic, I found myself doing a lot of talks, virtual talks, obviously, and I would often read from the Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron's tiny little book, Comfortable with Uncertainty. And for your purposes, Mark, for the purposes of this series, you might consider it Comfortable with Change.
Sure.
Okay. And there's a passage in there in which he talks about how all around us, the world is constantly changing and in flux. And she likens it to the weather and how winds are blowing and rain is blowing. And she challenges us to sit like a mountain in the midst of a hurricane.
Oh,
And I love that imagery. But I found myself challenged by the imagery as I started offering that to people who were just scared and freaked out at the beginning of the pandemic, right? And then I realized something. I realized that the mountain is not a stubborn and rigidly held point of view of the world. The mountain are our values.
okay.
The mountain are the things that matter. The mountain is implicit in questions like, have I been kind? And if we extend this metaphor a little bit, we say, how should we be in a world filled with change and tumult and transition and uncertainty? We should be a mountain, holding fast to our core beliefs like you have a right to love, safety, and belonging. My task is to be kind. And if I hold fast to those things, there's a naturally occurring joy that can come forth and be a source of inspiration and innovation. I think this is right.
I can't, because I continue, my mind continues to go to, again, thinking of that busy CEO or leader and so forth, and that coming back to your point about not asking the direct question or instructing, slow down and answer these questions, but asking them this question: what would it feel like to be the mountain in the middle of a huge storm? And let's start there.
Yeah. I
And I
mean,
mean, it could go so many different ways from there. It's yeah,
that's right. And a mountain that is, again, not rigid, not stubborn, but living, like living rock that is older than time itself and laughs at the storm.
yeah.
It's like, go ahead, blow all you want, whatever. This is what I know to be true.
The mountain has legacy.
The mountain has legacy. That's it. Nicely done. Thank you. Now I figured out my new book.
No, it's got to start with an R though. Jerry, I think that's just a beautiful place to wrap this conversation. Of course, no, we can go for hours, but as a nice, I don't want to say close because it's not closed, but a nice turn and drawing together of everything we've been speaking about, I think, in a nice visual and a really powerful question. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. And as always, I always leave these conversations with way more questions from you than I know that I wanted to ask you, which is as someone who loves curiosity, it's the greatest gift because then my journal opens up first thing tomorrow morning. And so it's like Christmas morning.
That makes me very, very happy. I know I'm doing my job when I leave the world with questions that are provocative and questions of what moves us.
Yeah.
Mark, it was a delight to connect with you as always. And I'm always at the other end of the podcasting headset whenever you need me.
Thank you. Thank you.